I will tell this as a story not of one heroine or one theater, but of many women whose ordeals intersected the great arc of the war. Some of them are known names, already in history books. Many more remain voices in survivor testimony, fragments in archives, or the memory passed down in families. Where I dramatize a small private scene to make sense of the facts, I have shaped it as a composite of confirmed testimonies rather than as an exact quotation. I will be careful, and wherever I can, I will anchor scenes to events and people recorded by historians. What follows is a narrative mosaic, fact-driven, human, at times harrowing, and always about the lives shaped by capture, confinement, resistance, and for some liberation. Prologue. The notebooks. I found the notebooks in a second-hand trunk, their covers cracked, their pages filled in a steady, slanted hand. They belonged to a woman named Margaret, not a celebrity, only one voice among thousands who had been interned in Southeast Asia. The notebooks described the daily arithmetic of scarcity, how to make broth from a scrap of bone, how to sew a child's shoe from a flour sack, how to hide a stray newspaper strip and read it by moonlight. When I traced the names, she wrote down Odette, Noor, Elsie, Anna, the Dutch women at Tijeng. The notebooks became a map. The more I followed the paths, the more obvious it became. World War II had no one gender of suffering. There were women who were combatants, covert operatives, nurses, teachers, mothers, forced laborers, and civilians. Some wore uniforms. Some were promised protection by international law. Some were rendered invisible by the categories of wartime bureaucracy. Across continents, an untold chorus of women were captured, imprisoned, interrogated, worked, executed, or liberated. Yet their stories have often been footnotes. Part I. Europe. Agents and resistance. The European war had its formal front lines and its secret ones. It also had a strange, terrible cruelty. Laws that defined who was a lawful combatant, and who, if caught, might be treated as a spy or a saboteur, punished without the protection normally afforded to captured soldiers. It is in this blunt encounter of law and violence that several of the most remarkable stories of women prisoners are found. Noor Inayat Khan was born in Moscow in 1914, the daughter of an Indian nobleman and an American Muslim scholar. She became a radio operator for Britain's Special Operations Executive, SOE, working clandestinely in occupied France. Trained in radio operation and encryption, Noor parachuted into France in 1943. Radio operators were especially vulnerable. Their necessary transmissions could be detected by German radio direction finding units. Noor maintained transmissions for months under constant danger. In October 1943, she was betrayed, arrested by the Gestapo, interrogated, and interrogators discovered that she refused to divulge information. She was sent through a chain of prisons and ultimately to Dachau. In September 1944, she was executed. The British government recognized her courage posthumously with the George Cross. Noor's story is a study in the particular peril of women operating in secret. SOE recruited women, in part because they could move in occupied territory with fewer assumptions of threat. But when discovered, the protections women might expect as civilians evaporated. Noor and others were treated not as prisoners of war but as spies. The distinction mattered. Captured enemy soldiers were, by treaty, supposed to receive certain protections. Captured spies and saboteurs were legally liable to severe punishment. The Gestapo and the Nazi security apparatus did not hesitate. Violet Szabo's life, a British-French woman of mixed heritage who served as an SOE courier, illustrates a similar trajectory. Parachuted into France in 1943 on missions to liaise with resistance groups, she was betrayed during one mission and captured. She endured interrogation and extreme conditions. Eventually, she was deported to Germany and executed in 1945. Her courage was recognized by British and French awards after the war. Violette's story was widely publicized in Britain and became a potent symbol of female courage. Other SOE women had different fates. Odette Sansom, later Odette Hallows, another SOE agent, was captured and tortured by the Gestapo, but survived imprisonment at Ravensbrück and other places. After the war, she was awarded the George Cross. That she survived did not make her time less brutal. Torture, solitary confinement, the constant threat of being transferred to extermination facilities were real and present. Many SOE women who were captured ended up in the concentration camp system rather than in the stalag system reserved for captured soldiers. In practice, that often meant they were stripped of legal protections and were subject to the full weight of Nazi penal and extermination policies. The net of German repression also caught women in the resistance, who were not officially agents, couriers, sabotage operatives, local leaders. The French resistance counted many such women. When they were captured, their fates varied. Some were shot, some were sent to prison camps, some were deported to Germany as forced labor. The security services treated women's participation as equally criminal, and in many cases female prisoners were used for propaganda or were publicly humiliated before being deported. The stories that have survived testimonies, trial records, the dossiers from the Gestapo reveal how gender shaped both the work women did in resistance and the particular cruelties they faced when captured. Ravensbrück was the concentration camp in Germany primarily set aside for women. It was not a POW camp, but it became an endpoint for many captured women from across Europe. Resistance fighters, political prisoners, Jews, Roma, and those rounded up as asocial. Life at Ravensbrück was systematic and industrial in its cruelty. Forced labor, medical experiments, starvation, executions. Many of the SOE women who survived the Gestapo's interrogation were sent there. Some of the others were executed elsewhere, at Natzweiler-Struthof, at Dachau, or transported to the gas chambers. The existence of Ravensbrück and the presence of captured women there is well documented. Afterward, the camp survivors became crucial witnesses in the post-war reckoning. Part 2. The Women of the Theater of War in the East. If Europe's secret war created a distinct pathway for captured women interrogation, transfer to concentration camps, sometimes execution, the Asian theater produced its own patterns of internment and cruelty. Japan's campaign in Asia produced a large number of civilian internees and a smaller but significant number of captured Allied military personnel, including nurses and support staff. The internment of women and children in the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and Hong Kong is among the most documented and harrowing of these stories. When Singapore fell in February 1942, then a major British bastion, tens of thousands of military personnel were captured. Among them were men and women. Singapore's civilian population also suffered. British, Australian, Dutch, American, and other civilian women and children were rounded up, and many were interned. The women often became the custodians of morale, organizing kitchens, schooling children, tending the sick, keeping records. Those tasks were more than social duties. They were sometimes life-saving. Medical shortages were constant. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and typhus were endemic. Food rations were cut to starvation levels. Red Cross parcels were sporadic or blocked. The Japanese military's conventions governing the treatment of internees were not observed consistently. One of the best documented camps in the Philippines is the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, turned into an internment camp soon after the fall of the Philippines. Thousands of civilians, Americans, British, Dutch, and others were held there in cramped buildings. Women in Santo Tomas organized clandestine schools for children, improvised hospitals for the sick, and small economies in the face of chronic shortages. They dug into dormitories or corridors to find space for families. The walls of the university became galleries of notes and prayers and makeshift calendars to mark days. When the United States Army reached Manila in 1945, the liberation of Santo Tomas was one of those dramatic episodes of sight and sound. Columns of skeletal internees, children clinging to women, the recognition that years had gone by in a confined, fragile world. The survivors' testimonies, preserved in oral histories and in contemporary diaries, make the endurance of these women and children visible. Further south, on the islands of the Dutch East Indies, places like Chideng, often spelled Chandeng, in Batavia, now Jakarta, became infamous as internment camps that held primarily women and children of the Dutch colonial population. Chideng developed a scalding reputation for overcrowding, harsh discipline, and the breakdown of what had been a colonial social order. Diaries, camp reports, and later testimonies record the hunger, the infantilizing of women by the camp administration, and the particular trauma of mothers unable to feed their children. Women at Tijadeng ran clandestine support networks, created schools, and tried to maintain dignity against a daily tide of humiliation. Jideng's conditions were thoroughly documented after the war and entered the evidence during trials of Japanese personnel responsible for the treatment of internees. Australian nurses and doctors were present in many theaters, and some were taken captive. In Singapore and in Hong Kong, nursing sisters were captured and interned. The story of the Canadian nurses captured in Hong Kong in December 1941 is also a striking example. A group of nurses who had been tending the wounded in the battle's aftermath found themselves interned alongside civilians. Their post-war memoirs and interviews describe the strain of caring for the sick with inadequate supplies, the attempts to maintain sanitary standards, and the psychological pressure of being responsible for lives in cramped, squalid conditions. A repeated theme in the Asian camps was the role of women as both caretakers and community organizers. Even under hunger, women found ways to feed children, to hide small comforts, to conduct small acts of rebellion, burying a forbidden news sheet, teaching French or mathematics in secret classes, writing plays to keep the children's spirits alive. In the absence of formal schooling, many women became the teachers. In families, they negotiated the priorities of rationing. They smuggled medicine where they could. Some women, particularly those who had been professionals before the war, nurses, teachers, missionaries, applied their skills within the camp walls to save lives and to make life tolerable. Part 3. The forced labor and displacement that blurred categories. Not all women imprisoned were held in organized internment camps. The war's machinery also deported and assigned women as forced laborers across Germany and occupied Europe, and the testimony of these women is often filed, bureaucratically, under forced laborers rather than POWs. Yet the lived experience, violent removal from home, transport in cattle trucks, long workdays under guard, inadequate food, disease shares much with prisoner of war narratives. Polish women deported in 1939, 1944 to work in Germany, in factories, on farms, in munitions, plants often labored under brutal supervision. Sometimes these women were assigned to agriculture, sometimes to factories producing weapons. Their records are scattered among Red Cross reports, post-war reparations claims, and local archives. Their testimonies emphasize the routine humiliation, the loss of identity cards, the threat of workplace violence, and the constant anxiety for those left behind. Similarly, Soviet women who served on the front lines, among them snipers, pilots, medics, sometimes fell into German hands. The German treatment of Soviet POWs, male and female, was uniquely brutal in comparison to the treatment accorded Western Allied prisoners. For political and racial reasons, many Soviet prisoners were deprived of the protections of the Hague and Geneva Conventions in practice, subjected to summary execution, starvation, or forced labor. The testimonies of Soviet women who survived capture often read like those of their male counterparts: harsh, forced labor, beatings, epidemics, but with the added gendered violence that accompanied occupation. For the Soviet state and for historians, these survivors' stories were often subsumed under broader narratives of the Great Patriotic War, leaving individual female narratives less attended to for years. Part 4. Women who served and were captured. Nurses, auxiliaries, and the gray area of law. Military medical women occupied a gray area. Nurses captured by Axis forces were often treated with a mix of recognition and suspicion. Under the Geneva Conventions, medical personnel should have protection, yet the chaotic reality of capture and the ideological assumptions of captors complicated the practice. The women who served in field hospitals in the Mediterranean and North Africa sometimes found themselves behind enemy lines as positions shifted. In Crete, 1941, during the fierce fighting after German airborne landings, some nursing sisters were captured. In Hong Kong, similar events occurred. The Japanese often treated military nurses as internees, that is, civilian-like internees, but not always. In many camps, nurses continued to serve, improvising wards, sterilizing with improvised methods, providing palliative care, comforting the dying. Their capture did not remove their mission. Instead, it placed them in resource-constrained situations where their training made a difference to survival rates. In Germany and Italy, the number of women enlisted in the armed services who were captured was smaller than in the East and Asia, but it did occur. In addition, women in resistance movements and in auxiliary services sometimes found themselves repurposed by the enemy into forced labor or imprisoned in penal institutions. Part V. The psychological and social aftermath. Survival did not mean the end of suffering. Women who returned from camps faced multiple layers of reintegration: physical rehabilitation, social stigma, the need to provide for families. For some, particularly those who had been raped or sexually assaulted, silence became a painful refuge. Many survivors found society unprepared to hear their stories or eager to put such experiences out of sight. In some cases, governments themselves had agendas that prioritized certain kinds of testimonies over others. The soldierhood of male veterans, for example, and women's stories of internment, maternal struggle, and underground work received less attention. Yet in other instances, women became public voices of testimony. The accounts of SOE women, the memoirs of interned nurses, and the legal evidence gathered for trials all contributed to a post-war narrative that gradually incorporated the experiences of female prisoners. Trials held in Europe for Nazi crimes and in the Far East for Japanese crimes collected testimony that fed into official archives, erasing silence by documentation. Part VI: Names and Known Stories. Throughout this narrative, several real women stand out because their stories are well documented. Noor Inayat Khan, SOE radio operator in France, betrayed, captured, and executed at Dachau in 1944, posthumously awarded the George Cross for bravery. Violette Sabo, British-French SOE courier, captured during a mission in France, deported to Germany, and executed in 1945, awarded the George Cross posthumously and French honors. Odette Sansom, Odette Hallows, SOE agent, captured and tortured by the Gestapo, imprisoned at Ravensbrück, survived, and post-war awarded the George Cross. André Borel, French-born SOE agent, captured and executed at Natzweiler-Struthof in 1944, among the first female SOE agents executed by the Nazis. The Canadian and British nurses captured in Hong Kong and the nurses interned throughout Southeast Asia. Their memoirs testify to the daily practice of nursing under siege, the creative improvisations, and the camaraderie that sustained lives in camp. The women internees of Santo Tomas, Manila, Chideng, Batavia, and Sime Road, Changi, Singapore. Groups of civilian women and children who kept schools and kitchens going under starvation-level rations, who documented births and deaths in ink-blotted registers, and whose letters and diaries supplied the evidence for post-war redress. These names and places are anchors in the historical record. They also point to a much larger body of experience that is less named, but no less real. Part 7. Small Acts. Large Courage. It is often in small acts that courage is most visible. The nurse who boiled water twice and managed to save 3 children from dysentery. The woman who mended a neighbor's shoe in the long queue for rice. The teacher who taught a burnt-out child to read with a smuggled pencil. These acts did not make it into headlines, but were decisive in everyday survival. Women in camps often formed the social scaffolding that kept lives from collapsing, organizing queues, mediating disputes over food, calming panics during raids, tending to the dying with whatever medicine they could find. Resistance within camps took forms, both small and large. There were secret letters to the outside where possible, covert exchanges of ration items, clandestine prayers and religious services, hidden literacy lessons to pass down culture and hope. In European camps, some women engaged in resistance by maintaining solidarity against the capos, and guards' goods were concealed. Sabotage of factory tools took place, where possible, and recorded notes were buried in jars for post-war testimony. Part 8. The Legal Reckoning and Remembrance. After 1945, the Allied powers pursued legal avenues to hold perpetrators accountable. In Europe, the Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings investigated crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the treatment of prisoners and internees. In the Pacific, the Tokyo trials and other tribunals tried Japanese leaders and officers accused of war crimes, including the abuse of prisoners. Testimony from women, whether internees, nurses, or resistance fighters, helped crystallize the case for crimes such as summary execution, forced labor, mistreatment of civilians, and the inhumane conditions that caused mass mortality. The legal world has its limits. Not every perpetrator was tried. Not every survivor received restitution. But the process did create a record: depositions, affidavits, photographs, and diaries that future scholars and family historians could use to reconstruct lives. The record opened a public space for remembering the female experience of war captivity. Monuments, memorial plaques, books, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Epilogue: why the stories were untold and why they matter. Why were these women's stories so often untold? There are several reasons. First, the structure of wartime bureaucracies often framed suffering in male terms: soldiers, prisoners of war, fighters. Women's captive experiences were sometimes categorized differently as civilians, internees, forced laborers, wives, and mothers, and those categories made their testimonies less likely to be recorded as military histories. Second, there was stigma. Sexual violence, a common but underreported feature of wartime capture and occupation, brought shame and silence. Third, post-war public narratives often privileged the soldier's tale and the visible face of victorious armies. The quieter stories of women keeping families alive in internment did not fit easily into triumphalist memories. Yet these stories matter. They complicate our moral imagination of war. They reveal the multiple ways in which gender, law, and violence intersect. They show how the international legal categories that are supposed to protect people in war, prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions, civilians under occupation, can break down in the face of ideology and brute force. They demonstrate the resourcefulness of women under conditions of extreme scarcity and the moral leadership many provided in the most private, crucial tasks. I ended, for a moment, with the notebooks I found in that trunk. Margaret's pages recorded not just the injuries and the lists of rations, but the voice of a woman who insisted upon the record. She noted births and deaths with the same hand. She wrote down a joke a child told. She recorded the names of women who had taught her to keep a ledger of supplies. Many such notebooks exist, scattered across archives. Collected together, they form an archive of endurance. Postscript: what the archives teach us. Historians have, in recent decades, done the hard work of gathering the fragments, recording interviews with surviving internees, indexing official files, transcribing camp registers, collecting oral histories. Books and museums now present those stories more widely. The tales of SOE women like Noor and Odette are better known. The experiences of women in the Far East camps have been the subjects of documentaries and memoirs. Their evidence was used in post-war tribunals. But the archive is never complete. New fragments, a diary found in a trunk, a legal deposition in a provincial court, an old photograph unearthed in an attic, continue to add shades of meaning to our picture of what women endured. In the end, the untold stories are less untold than undertold. They have been told in hundreds of small ways, in the stitched records of a camp, in a nurse's recollection, in the legal testimony of a trial, in a homecoming letter, in the wan smile of a woman who had seen too much.